Welcome to Chapter 9. This is the chapter we're going to talk about genes and inheritance. I know some of you are really excited about this topic, so we're going to dive right in. And the first thing to talk about is the concept of heredity. So this is this idea of passing characteristics from parents to offspring. We've already talked about this some, but specifically now, since we've got some more terms under our belt, passing those characteristics from parents to offspring through their genes. So through that DNA, but specifically the genes, those sets of directions that are located on the DNA in those chromosomes. So these characteristics, these traits, some of them are controlled by just a single gene. We'll see some of them are controlled by multiple genes. And this idea of heredity has actually been around for a long time. We've known about heredity for quite a long time. So you've actually talked about this in class. We talked about selective breeding back at the very beginning of the semester. We talked about things like breeding pigs and cows. So that idea of making bigger animals or making corn ears bigger by selecting the bigger ones over time. But why I wanted to show you this one, just to bring this back, is that we don't just select the bigger animals, but now we're also recognizing that the smaller versions can be helpful. So I know when we talked about this before, we talked about small pigs, micro pigs. Well, we've also been breeding small horses. So this horse that's in this picture is almost full grown. And we've been breeding these smaller horses as seeing eye horses for those who have vision impairment. Because these horses live longer than dogs and other service animals, and so they are able to serve their owners for a lot longer period of time. And just as a side note, they're super cute when they're wearing their shoes because to protect their hooves, most of them actually wear little tennis shoes when they need to walk on things like cement. So other things related to heredity that you may already be familiar with, you might have noticed at this point that your textbooks likes fruit flies, they like rabbits, and they like cats. But cats are a great example of single gene traits. So you may have noticed that cats only come in two varieties or two flavors for fur. They only are going to be either short-haired cats or long-haired cats. This is controlled by a single gene. So cats are only going to inherit genes that will make them either short hairs or long hairs. The other gene, I just noticed I'm covering up the picture. Sorry. Is they will either be white colored fur or white haired cats, or they're going to inherit the gene for colored hair. Now you'll see that yes, some cats do have white hair, and so that gene can be inherited. They can get both copies, but it gets turned on just in some places on their body, which is an interesting way that can work. But it is a single gene trait, so you can see it only shows up in one spot on their body. Are there multiple gene traits? Yes, there's a lot of them, and that's actually more common in humans than single gene traits. But we're actually going to look at single gene traits that are passing from parent to child because that's easier to understand and follow than multi-gene traits. And then we'll expand from that model to look at exceptions or these multi-gene traits and some of the things that kind of break the rules. So before we get into that, I just want to take a little sidebar and show you what people thought was happening as far as passing on these characteristics. So this was the idea, and today it just sounds ridiculous to us, but for a long period of time, you can see it was actually, this idea was introduced in the 1600s and was popular through the 1800s. And this is the idea that there was a tiny pre-made human in every sperm cell, and that tiny pre-made human was transferred to the egg cell and then developed. Um, then in the 1800s, people really started to think about this critically and realized that this really didn't make that much sense, because then all of the offspring should look a lot like the fathers. And a lot of offspring actually had characteristics of the mothers. They did actually have, those different kinds of characteristics like hair color, eye color, and so forth that they shared with their mothers as well. So Mendel was a scientist who first really studied this in more depth, and he learned about heredity by conducting experiments using pea plants. Mendel's an interesting guy. He actually was a monk as well as a scientist, so he conducted his experiments at the monastery in their gardens, growing his pea plants year after year and making meticulous records of what was happening. So why peas? Why would he pick pea plants of any plant to use? Well, one, they're fairly easy to grow. I know some of you guys had problems getting your plants to grow for your experiment this year, um, but we didn't use any peas. Peas are pretty easy to get to grow, especially in places like Ohio and where Mendel was working, very similar type of environment. They're easy to breed and cross-pollinate. So peas actually self-pollinate if you leave them to just do their own thing. And if you want to cross-pollinate them, so breed one plant with another plant, they're very easy to manipulate. You can go in and take out the male part of the flower, and then take a brush basically and move the pollen from one flower to another flower. These guys also reproduce quickly and very prolifically. They have lots of offspring. So usually you can have 1 to 2 generations per year. So you can get multiple sets of results. And 2 plants can actually produce dozens to hundreds of offspring. So it gives you lots and lots of data in order to figure out what's going on. One last reason why Mendel picked peas, and he got really lucky with peas, is that they have lots of characteristics that fall into good categories of either or. So pea plants, the variety that he used, are either short or tall, no in between. Seeds are either round or wrinkled, yellow or green. The coat colors are either green or white, that's the outside. The pods are either big and poofy, or they pull in so you can see all of the peas. The pods are either yellow or green, and where the flowers are located are either along the pea vine or at the tips of the pea vine. The other one is the flower color, that's the one we're going to focus on, and the flowers are either purple or white. So this made it very easy for him to conduct his experiments, because the characteristics were very straightforward, one or the other, no in-betweens. There's just a either or choice. So the first thing that he had to do was get what he called true breeding plants. So I told you we were going to look at flower color, so there are the flowers, purple or white. So before he started his experiments, what he would do is repeatedly breed together similar plants. So he would do this until he got plants that produced offspring with the same traits as the parents. So for example, he would take purple flower plants and breed purple flower to purple flower. And he'd do this over and over again until he only got offspring that had purple flowers. So every single pea plant that came from those parents, after he bred them over and over again, they only produced purple flowers. Then he'd do the same thing with the white flowers. Breed them white flower to white flower over and over until all of the offspring they got would only be growing white flower plants. So oh, there we go. And he'd do this not just for the flowers, but also for the other characteristics. So wrinkled pea parents would only have wrinkled pea offspring, or smooth pea parents would only have smooth pea offspring. This way he knew that all of the organisms had just the characteristics he was looking for. So when he started to cross them, he knew that only, for example, the flowers, he only had purple characteristics in one set of plants and white characteristic flowers in the other set of plants. So this brings us to Mendel's law of segregation, and this is what he actually got from his first set of experiments. You've got 2 copies of each gene, but you only have 1 copy in each sperm or egg. And so we're going to take a look at what he did with his experiments and how he figured this out. So he had his true breeding plants. So we're going to look at the flower color. So he had his true breeding purple. They only produce purple offspring, and a true breeding white flower plant. So only produced white offspring. He would cross-pollinate these guys. So purple flower to white flower, and then have them produce their peas, and then grow their offspring and see what happened. And if you look, what happened? All of the offspring that these 2 produced are going to have purple flowers. Every time this experiment runs, this is what happens. So let me move me over here. So then what he did, he's like, well, okay, they're all purple, but I know that this white flower is in here somewhere because we started with a white flower. So he took 2 of these offspring plants and he bred them together to see what would happen. And let's take a look. When he did that, do you see what happened? We've got white flower and a white flower. The white flowers came back. So we've got mostly purple offspring, but we've got some white flowers now. And so what he got from this was the idea of a dominant trait and a recessive trait. So a dominant trait is one that masks or covers up a recessive trait. And so in this case, he figured out that purple, the purple flower characteristic, is dominant over the white characteristic because when he bred them together, the purple one covered up the white information. It hid it. That's kind of why it's recessive. It's hiding, it's recessed, it's hiding behind the dominant trait. And the dominant one is out front saying, hi, I'm here. And so when he then took these 2 that had both copies and bred them together, the recessive trait appeared again because it didn't have the dominant one to cover it up in all of the plants. So let's take a look at what's happening with the genes themselves. Oops, sorry. Tried to move myself. So here's what was actually going on. This is the second set. So if we go over here, we're looking at what happened here. So we know that they each got a copy of the purple and a copy of the white gene. Okay, and we'll come back to all the terms. Don't worry about those right now. So they each got a copy of the purple and the white. So you can see those different colored bands. And we know from meiosis that these genes are going to get divided, right? They'll get copied and then they're going to get divided into the gametes with 1 copy going to each gamete. So they only show 2 here, but we know that there's 2 that'll get purple and 2 that are going to get white, right? And so if you look at the arrows, it's showing 2 purple arrows and 2 white arrows. Same thing over here, so that when fertilization happens, you end up with 2 copies in each of the new plants in different combinations. And we'll come back in our next lecture and talk about what's going on as far as these combinations go.